The Atlantic Ocean, June 4, 1944. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David stands on the heaving deck of a whaleboat, spray soaking through his uniform, watching a German submarine break the surface 300 yards ahead. Water cascades from its conning tower. Its hull circles slowly, like a dying animal. Somewhere inside that steel cylinder are demolition charges set to detonate, sea valves open to flood compartments, and 2 tons of classified intelligence that could change the course of the war. David has perhaps 15 minutes before the submarine sinks into 2 miles of ocean. He has never been inside a German U-boat. Neither has anyone else in the United States Navy. The decision he makes in the next 60 seconds will either hand the Allies their greatest intelligence victory of the Atlantic War, or send him and 7 other men to the bottom of the sea, inside an enemy vessel rigged to explode. This is the story of the only German submarine captured on the high seas by the United States Navy during World War II, and the secret those men were ordered to keep for the next 15 years. The war in the Atlantic had become a war of mathematics and endurance. By the spring of 1944, the United States and Great Britain were sinking German submarines at an accelerating rate, but each kill came at the cost of merchant tonnage, fuel, ammunition, and the lives of convoy sailors. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won through attrition, but attrition is the slowest and bloodiest path to victory. Allied intelligence officers understood that destroying submarines was necessary, but insufficient. What they needed was to see inside the mind of the enemy, to read the orders flowing between German Naval Command and the wolf packs hunting in the deep Atlantic. They needed to break the codes that allowed U-boats to coordinate attacks, to intercept supply vessels, to vanish into the vastness of the ocean and reappear where convoys were most vulnerable. And breaking those codes required capturing the machines and documents that generated them. This was not a new idea. British forces had seized Enigma materials from disabled U-boats earlier in the war, and those captures had provided critical breakthroughs for the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. But the United States Navy had never succeeded in boarding and capturing an enemy submarine intact. American doctrine focused on destruction. Depth charges were designed to crush hulls and kill crews, not preserve vessels for intelligence exploitation. There was no manual for boarding a sinking enemy warship in the middle of the Atlantic, no training program for disarming German demolition charges, or navigating flooded compartments filled with unfamiliar machinery. The idea of capturing a U-boat was tactically sound and operationally insane. Captain Daniel Gallery understood this contradiction perfectly. He was the commander of a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, and by the spring of 1944, his task group had become one of the most effective anti-submarine units in the Atlantic Fleet. Gallery was aggressive, inventive, and deeply frustrated by the limitations of conventional anti-submarine warfare. Every time his ships forced a U-boat to the surface and watched it scuttle, he saw intelligence materials sinking beyond recovery. He saw cipher machines, code books, patrol orders, and technical manuals disappearing into the abyss. He saw opportunities slipping away. On April 9, 1944, ships under Gallery's command located and attacked German submarine U-515 west of Madeira. The engagement followed the standard pattern: sonar contact, depth charge runs, damage assessment, renewed attacks. U-515 was commanded by Captain Lieutenant Werner Henk, one of the most experienced and decorated submarine commanders in the Kriegsmarine. Henk was no novice. He had sunk 24 Allied ships over the course of multiple patrols, but experience and skill could not overcome the mathematics of the hunt. Gallery's ships had modern sonar, coordinated tactics, and enough depth charges to saturate the ocean until something broke. After hours of sustained attack, U-515 surfaced, her crew abandoning ship as water poured into ruptured compartments. 44 German sailors were pulled from the water. The submarine sank stern first, taking everything inside her down into darkness. Gallery watched the submarine disappear and made a decision. Sinking U-boats was no longer enough. The next one, he decided, would be captured. The idea seemed absurd to almost everyone who heard it. Capturing a warship required boarding it, and boarding a damaged submarine in the middle of the Atlantic meant sending men into a sinking steel tube filled with explosives, unfamiliar equipment, and the very real possibility of hostile crew members still inside. German submarine doctrine included specific instructions for scuttling, open sea valves, set demolition charges, destroy cipher materials, abandon ship. A boarding party would be racing against all three. They would have minutes, perhaps less, to enter a vessel they had never seen before, locate and close valves in flooded compartments, find and disarm explosive charges, and somehow prevent the submarine from sinking long enough to secure intelligence materials. And they would be doing all of this while under fire, in heavy seas, with no backup and no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. Gallery began preparing anyway. He handpicked an 8-man boarding party from volunteers within the task group and selected Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David to lead them. David was a damage control officer aboard USS Pillsbury, one of the destroyer escorts assigned to Guadalcanal's screen. He was 23 years old, methodical, and calm under pressure. He was also terrified, though he would not admit it until much later. The training began immediately. The boarding team studied captured diagrams of German-type IX submarines, memorizing the layout of compartments, the location of sea valves, the placement of demolition charges, the design of watertight doors. They practiced moving through confined spaces in darkness. They rehearsed the specific tasks each man would perform: closing valves, searching for demolition charges, gathering documents, securing machinery. They drilled until the movements became automatic, because there would be no time for hesitation once they were inside. But there was a gap between training and reality that no amount of preparation could fully close. The diagrams were incomplete. The actual conditions inside a damaged, flooding submarine could not be replicated, and there was no way to know whether the submarine they eventually boarded would match the layout they had memorized, or whether the German crew would have time to complete their scuttling procedures before the boarding party arrived. The entire plan rested on speed, luck, and the hope that circumstances would align in their favor long enough to make the impossible merely extraordinarily dangerous. June 4, 1944. The Guadalcanal Task Group was operating off the coast of West Africa, near Cape Blanco, part of a coordinated Allied effort to intercept German submarines transiting between European bases and operational areas in the South Atlantic. The weather was clear, the sea moderate. At mid-morning, sonar operators aboard USS Chatelaine detected a submerged contact moving slowly at depth. The contact was classified as probable submarine. Gallery ordered an immediate attack. Chatelaine closed on the contact and began dropping depth charges in a calculated pattern designed to bracket the submarine's probable position and force it toward the surface. The charges detonated in sequence, sending columns of water skyward and transmitting shockwaves through the ocean that rattled equipment and shattered lights inside the submerged vessel. U-505, commanded by Oberleutnant Zur C. Harold Lange, was an aging Type IXC submarine on her 12th war patrol. She had been at sea for months, operating under constant strain, mechanical problems accumulating faster than the crew could repair them. Lange was under orders to return to base, but the voyage home required crossing thousands of miles of Allied-controlled waters, and the crossing had just become significantly more dangerous. The depth charges were relentless. Chatelain's sonar provided continuous updates on the submarine's position, allowing the destroyer escort to adjust her attack pattern and maintain pressure. Inside U-505, the crew struggled to maintain trim as explosions rocked the hull, shaking loose equipment and opening seams that began leaking seawater into the pressure hull. Damage reports came in from multiple compartments. The submarine was wounded, her ability to maneuver compromised, her depth-keeping equipment failing. Lange faced an impossible choice: remain submerged and risk being crushed by the next salvo of depth charges, or surface into the guns of the enemy warships waiting above. He ordered the submarine to surface. U-505 broke through at 11:09 in the morning, water streaming from her conning tower and deck as compressed air forced ballast tanks clear. The moment she appeared, every ship in the task group opened fire. 40mm guns, 20mm cannons, and 50-caliber machine guns poured suppressive fire onto the submarine's deck and conning tower, not to sink her, but to prevent her crew from manning the deck gun or organizing resistance. The noise was overwhelming. Tracers arced across the water. Shells struck the submarine's hull and ricocheted into the sky, sending fragments of metal spinning through the air. The German crew began evacuating immediately. Men scrambled out of the conning tower hatch and dove into the ocean, swimming away from the submarine as fast as they could. They had been trained to scuttle. Before abandoning ship, the engineering crew had opened sea valves in the engine room and set the boat's demolition charges. U-505 was already flooding. She had minutes left before the ocean claimed her. Gallery saw the evacuation and made the decision he had been preparing for since April. He ordered the whaleboat away. Albert David and his 7-man boarding team were already assembled, carrying sidearms, tools, flashlights, and absolutely no illusions about the danger ahead. The whaleboat lowered into the water and began pulling toward the submarine, which was now circling slowly to port. Her rudder jammed, her decks awash, water pouring into her hull through the open valves below. David stood in the bow of the whaleboat, watching the distance close. The submarine looked massive from water level, a dark steel wall rising and falling with the swell, seawater cascading off her ballast tank vents and flooding ports. She was still under fire. Shells were still striking her conning tower. The air smelled of cordite and salt and diesel fuel leaking from ruptured tanks inside the hull. David knew the demolition charges were set. He knew the valves were open. He knew that stepping aboard that submarine meant entering a vessel that was actively trying to sink itself. And he knew that if he hesitated, if he allowed fear to dictate his actions, the entire operation would fail, and the intelligence inside U-505 would be lost forever. The whaleboat came alongside. David did not wait for the coxswain to secure a line. He jumped, caught hold of the submarine's wet deck plating and pulled himself aboard. The steel was slick with seawater and oil. The submarine rolled beneath him, unstable, her buoyancy failing as flooding continued below. The rest of the boarding party followed, scrambling onto the deck and moving immediately toward the conning tower. Suppressive fire from the escort ship ceased. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. David climbed the conning tower ladder and paused at the hatch. Somewhere below in the darkness was either an empty submarine or a German crew waiting to defend their vessel or detonate the charges that would kill everyone aboard. There was only one way to find out. He drew his pistol, took a breath, and dropped through the hatch into the control room. The interior of U-505 was chaos. Emergency lighting cast everything in dim red shadows. Water was already ankle-deep in the control room and rising steadily, pouring in from the aft compartments through open watertight doors. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, battery acid, and human sweat. Equipment hung loose from damaged mounts. Papers floated in the rising water, and the submarine was completely, utterly empty. The German crew had abandoned ship so quickly that they had left everything behind: personal belongings, navigation charts, logbooks, cipher materials, everything. It was the intelligence officer's dream and the boarding party's nightmare, because the intelligence was only valuable if they could keep the submarine afloat long enough to secure it. David shouted orders. The team split into pre-assigned groups. Electrician's mate Zenon Lukosius headed aft toward the engine room to locate and close the sea valves that were flooding the boat. Torpedoman's mate Stanley WWII moved forward to search for demolition charges and disarm them. Radioman Arthur Nispel began gathering documents and equipment from the radio room. The rest of the team spread through the submarine, searching compartments, closing valves, and trying to slow the flooding that was pulling U-505 toward the bottom. Lukosius reached the engine room and found water pouring through two open sea valves, the flow so powerful it created a visible current through the compartment. The valves were German naval equipment, unfamiliar in design, and the labeling was in a language Lukosius could barely read. He grabbed the nearest valve wheel and began turning it, forcing it closed against the pressure of the incoming water. The flow slowed. He moved to the second valve and repeated the process, muscles straining, hands slipping on the wet metal. The valve resisted, jammed or corroded or deliberately sabotaged. He braced himself and pulled harder, and the wheel finally turned. The second flow stopped. The flooding was not halted, but it was slowed enough that pumps might be able to keep pace. WWII found the demolition charges in the torpedo room, exactly where the training diagrams had indicated they would be. The charges were simple: scuttling explosives designed to rupture the hull and ensure the submarine could not be salvaged. They had not detonated. Either the German crew had not had time to arm them properly, or the fuses had failed, or the charges had been set with a delay that had not yet expired. WWII did not waste time speculating. He carefully disconnected the charges, rendered them safe, and moved on to search for additional explosives that might be hidden elsewhere in the boat. In the radio room, Nispel was pulling documents out of storage lockers and equipment cabinets, stacking them in piles away from the rising water. Code books, cipher tables, weather charts, patrol orders, technical manuals. And then, in a locked cabinet that had been left open in the crew's haste to evacuate, he found two Enigma cipher machines, still set with their current rotor configurations, still loaded with the keys that would allow Allied cryptanalysts to read German naval communications for the immediate operational period. Nispel stared at the machines for 3 seconds, processing the magnitude of what he was holding, and then carefully wrapped them in waterproof material and passed them up through the conning tower to the whaleboat crew waiting above. David moved through the submarine, checking progress, coordinating efforts, and fighting the rising sense of unreality that came from standing inside an enemy warship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The flooding was under control, but the submarine was still sinking, her bow settling lower in the water as residual flooding continued in compartments the boarding party could not access. Pumps were brought aboard from the escort ships and lowered into the hull diesel-powered units that roared to life and began pulling water out of the bilges and pumping it over the side. Slowly, incrementally, U-505 stabilized. Her bow stopped sinking. Her buoyancy held. The immediate crisis had passed. But the larger problem remained. U-505 was drifting in the middle of the Atlantic, 3,000 miles from the nearest Allied port, with a jammed rudder, no propulsion, and a hull that was still taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it. Gallery ordered a tow line rigged. USS Guadalcanal's engineering crew fabricated a towing bridle and passed it to the submarine, where David's team secured it to U-505's deck cleats. The tow began slowly, carefully, with the escort carrier pulling the submarine at a crawl to avoid putting too much strain on the damaged hull. It was a precarious operation. If the tow line parted, or if the submarine's hull failed, or if the pumps could not keep up with the flooding, U-505 would sink and everything they had risked would be lost. Gallery had one more decision to make, and it was the most important one of the entire operation. U-505 was now in Allied hands, along with 2 Enigma machines, 900 pounds of code books and cipher materials, technical manuals for German acoustic homing torpedoes, and a complete archive of the submarine's patrol logs and operational orders. This material represented an intelligence windfall of staggering proportions. Allied cryptanalysts could use the captured Enigma machines and code books to read German naval communications in near real time, allowing convoy routing officers to avoid U-boat patrol areas, hunter-killer groups to intercept submarines in transit, and operational planners to understand the capabilities and limitations of German naval technology. But all of that was only possible if the Germans did not know U-505 had been captured. If Berlin learned that a submarine had been taken intact with cipher materials aboard, every code would be changed immediately, every procedure revised, every operational advantage lost. Gallery issued orders that were unprecedented in their scope and severity. There would be no radio transmissions reporting the capture, no log entries, no official documentation. The prisoners taken from U-505's crew would be isolated from all other German prisoners of war, held incommunicado in a special camp where they could not communicate with the outside world or reveal what had happened to their submarine. The men of the boarding party and the crews of the task group would be sworn to absolute secrecy, forbidden from mentioning the capture to anyone, including their families, for the duration of the war and potentially beyond. And U-505 herself would be towed across the Atlantic in complete silence, a ghost ship moving through Allied shipping lanes without acknowledgement or record. The tow took 17 days. 17 days of maintaining constant watch on the submarine's pumps, monitoring her hull for signs of structural failure, and praying that the weather would hold. 17 days of maintaining radio silence while other Allied forces continued normal operations, unaware that a captured German submarine was being dragged slowly toward Bermuda. 17 days during which any mechanical failure, any storm, any chance encounter with another U-boat could have ended the operation and sent U-505 to the bottom. The weather did not hold. On the 9th day, a storm system moved through the area, bringing heavy seas and winds that put enormous strain on the tow line and the submarine's damaged hull. U-505 pitched and rolled in the swells, water breaking over her deck, the tow line snapping tight, and then slackening as the two vessels rose and fell out of sync with each other. The pumps struggled to keep pace with the water coming in through hatches and vents, and a dozen small leaks that had opened in the hull plating. For 6 hours it was uncertain whether the submarine would survive. The boarding party, still aboard, worked frantically to shore up damaged areas and keep the pumps running. And then the storm passed, the seas calmed, and the tow continued. On June 19, 1944, 15 days after the capture, USS Guadalcanal and U-505 arrived at the naval base in Bermuda. The submarine was moved into a secure dry dock, hidden from view, and immediately swarmed by intelligence officers, technical specialists, and cryptanalysts who began the detailed process of exploiting every piece of equipment and every scrap of paper found aboard. The Enigma machines and code books were flown to Washington and Britain, where teams at the Navy's Cryptanalytics Service and Bletchley Park used them to refine and accelerate their penetration of German naval codes. The acoustic torpedoes were disassembled and analyzed, revealing details of their guidance systems and acoustic signatures that allowed Allied engineers to develop more effective countermeasures. The patrol logs and operational orders provided insights into German submarine tactics, deployment patterns, and strategic priorities that informed Allied planning for the remainder of the Atlantic campaign. And through all of this, the secret held. Germany never learned that U-505 had been captured. Berlin's records listed the submarine as lost with all hands, sunk by depth charges on June 4, 1944. The German Navy continued using the same cipher systems, the same code books, the same operational procedures, completely unaware that the Allies were reading their communications with increasing accuracy and speed. Convoy routing became more effective. Hunter-killer groups intercepted submarines with suspicious frequency. The already declining U-boat fleet suffered losses that German Naval Command could not explain, sinkings that seemed to suggest the Allies had developed some new detection technology or tactical innovation. They never suspected the truth, that one of their own submarines had been captured intact and was giving away their secrets. The intelligence value of U-505's capture is difficult to quantify with precision, because the material seized from the submarine was integrated into a larger code-breaking effort that included multiple sources and methods. But the impact was real. During the summer of 1944, the period when the captured Enigma materials were most current and operationally relevant, Allied success rates against German submarines increased measurably. Convoy losses declined. U-boat sinkings accelerated. The Battle of the Atlantic, already turning in the Allies' favor, shifted even more decisively toward Allied victory, and the men who had made it possible were forbidden from speaking about what they had done. The secrecy lasted for 15 years. The men of the boarding party returned to their ships and continued serving, carrying the knowledge of what they had accomplished, but unable to share it with anyone. They watched the war end without recognition for their role in hastening that ending. They returned to civilian life and built careers and families, and they kept silent about the day they had boarded a sinking German submarine in the middle of the Atlantic and changed the course of the war. Albert David received the Medal of Honor for his actions, but the citation was carefully worded to avoid revealing that U-505 had been captured intact. The rest of the boarding party received lesser decorations, and none of them could explain to their loved ones exactly what they had done to earn them. U-505 remained hidden. After the war, the submarine was kept at the naval base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, classified and inaccessible, while intelligence agencies debated what to do with her. The fear was that revealing the capture might compromise ongoing intelligence operations or expose the fact that Allied code-breaking had played a larger role in the war than the public understood. So the submarine sat in storage, slowly deteriorating, a physical artifact of an operation that officially had never happened. In 1954, the Navy agreed to release U-505 for public display, and the submarine was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. The transfer required towing the submarine through the St. Lawrence Seaway and across the Great Lakes, a journey almost as improbable as her original capture. On September 3, 1954, U-505 was installed on outdoor display at the museum, where she became one of the most popular exhibits in the institution's history. Only then were the men who had captured her allowed to speak publicly about what they had done. Harold Lange, the commander of U-505 at the time of her capture, survived the war in prisoner-of-war camps and returned to Germany, where he lived quietly, unaware that his submarine had been preserved and put on display in the United States. He learned of U-505's fate in the 1960s, when photographs of the museum exhibit appeared in German publications. His reaction was not recorded, but the fact of the submarine's survival must have been startling, a physical reminder that the war he thought he understood had contained secrets he had never suspected. The capture of U-505 represented a convergence of preparation, opportunity, and extraordinary individual courage. Gallery's decision to plan for a boarding operation before an opportunity presented itself. David's willingness to lead his team into a sinking enemy vessel under conditions that violated every principle of safe seamanship. The technical skill of men like Lucosius and WWII, who performed complex tasks in unfamiliar surroundings under time pressure that allowed no margin for error. And the discipline of thousands of men who kept the secret for 15 years, understanding that the intelligence value of their silence outweighed the personal satisfaction of recognition. The operation succeeded because multiple improbable factors aligned at the same moment. The German crew abandoned U-505 without completing the scuttling process, leaving the submarine intact enough to board. The demolition charges failed to detonate, whether by accident or because of faulty fuses or incomplete arming procedures. The flooding was severe but not catastrophic, allowing the boarding party enough time to close valves and stabilize the submarine before she sank. The weather held long enough to establish the tow. The tow line held for 17 days across 3,000 miles of ocean, and the secret held for 15 years through the end of the war, the occupation of Germany, and the beginning of the Cold War. Any one of those factors failing would have changed the outcome. If the German crew had completed their scuttling procedures, U-505 would have sunk before the boarding party arrived. If the demolition charges had detonated, everyone aboard would have been killed. If the flooding had been more severe, the submarine would have gone down despite the boarding party's efforts. If the tow line had parted, or if the weather had been worse, or if the secret had leaked, the intelligence value would have been lost. The operation existed on the edge of possibility, and it succeeded because men like Albert David made decisions in moments of extreme pressure that pushed outcomes toward success rather than failure. That is the nature of history at the human scale. The grand sweep of events, the movement of armies and the decisions of nations, rests ultimately on the actions of individual people making choices in circumstances where failure is always more probable than success. The capture of U-505 changed the trajectory of the Battle of the Atlantic in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to dismiss. The intelligence gathered from that submarine flowed into a system that helped protect convoys, sink enemy submarines, and maintain the flow of supplies and reinforcements that made the invasion of Europe possible. And it happened because a small group of men were willing to do something that doctrine said was impossible, and common sense said was suicidal, and they succeeded because they refused to accept that the obstacles were insurmountable. The submarine still sits in Chicago, moved indoors in 2005 to protect her from further deterioration, preserved as a monument to the men who captured her, and the operation that remained secret for 15 years. Visitors walk through her compartments, seeing the control room where Albert David dropped through the hatch into darkness, the engine room where Zenon Lucosius closed the sea valves, the radio room where Arthur Nispel found the Enigma machines. The physical space is cramped, confining, and claustrophobic, even in the safety and comfort of a museum setting. It is difficult to imagine performing complex technical tasks in those compartments while they were flooding, in darkness, under fire, with explosives somewhere in the hull and minutes remaining before the ocean claimed everything. It is difficult, but it is necessary, because understanding what those men did requires confronting the reality of what they faced. The war in the Atlantic was won by many people doing many things over the course of years. Convoy escorts that defended merchant ships through storm and submarine attack. Codebreakers who worked in secret to penetrate enemy communications. Engineers who designed better sonar and radar and weapon systems. Intelligence analysts who pieced together fragmentary information into actionable operational pictures. And 8 men who boarded a sinking German submarine on June 4, 1944, and refused to let it sink until they had taken everything inside it that could help win the war. That is the story that matters, not the machinery or the technology or the abstract strategic considerations, but the human decisions made in moments when the outcome was uncertain and the stakes were absolute. Albert David standing on the deck of a whaleboat, watching a German submarine circle in the water ahead, knowing the demolition charges were set and the valves were open, and his orders were to board her anyway. Zenon Lukosius in the flooded engine room, forcing valve wheels closed against the pressure of the incoming ocean. Stanley WWII disconnecting explosives in the torpedo room, working with tools and techniques he had learned from diagrams, and hoping the reality matched the training. Arthur Nispel gathering documents and cipher machines, while water rose around his ankles and the submarine settled lower in the water. Those are the moments that changed history, not because the men involved were superhuman or because they had capabilities beyond normal human limits, but because they made decisions under pressure that favored action over paralysis, courage over caution, and mission success over personal safety. The capture of U-505 was not inevitable. It was contingent, precarious, and improbable. It succeeded because specific people made specific choices at specific moments, and those choices compounded into an outcome that shifted the balance of the Atlantic War in ways that reverberated through the remainder of the conflict and beyond. 15 years of silence. 15 years of carrying knowledge that could not be shared, of understanding the significance of actions that could not be acknowledged, of knowing that history had turned on a decision made in the space between heartbeats on a June morning in the Atlantic. And when the silence finally ended, when the story could finally be told, it emerged as something more than just another war story. It became a reminder that history is made by people who refuse to accept that the impossible is necessarily so, and who are willing to risk everything on the chance that courage and skill and preparation might be enough to turn probability into reality. The submarine sits in Chicago, preserved and protected, a physical connection to an event that exists now primarily in memory and record. The men who captured her are gone, their lives lived and their stories told. But the fact of what they did remains, solid and undeniable, a monument not just to their courage, but to the idea that individual human action still matters, that the decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can change the course of events in ways that echo across decades. June 4, 1944. A German submarine surfaces in the Atlantic, damaged and sinking, her crew abandoning ship, her secrets contained in locked cabinets and coded machines. And 8 men decide that those secrets are worth the risk, worth boarding a vessel that is actively trying to sink itself, worth descending into darkness and water and the possibility of sudden death, because the intelligence inside might save lives and shorten the war, and turn the tide of history in ways that cannot be fully calculated but are nonetheless real. They succeeded. The submarine was captured. The intelligence was secured. The secret was kept. And the war in the Atlantic shifted, incrementally but measurably, toward the outcome that would eventually emerge in the spring of 1945 when Germany surrendered and the guns fell silent and the ocean returned to peace. That is the story. That is what happened. And it matters, not because it was inevitable or predetermined or part of some grand historical arc, but because it was contingent and improbable and dependent on the choices of specific people in moments when failure would have been easier and more rational than success. If you found yourself in Captain Daniel Gallery's position, with a damaged enemy submarine circling in front of you and minutes to decide whether to send men aboard or destroy it and move on, what would you choose? Would you risk the lives of your boarding party for the possibility of intelligence that might or might not be valuable? Or would you follow doctrine and sink the submarine, and accept that some opportunities cannot be pursued without accepting unacceptable risk? The men of June 4th, 1944 made their choice. They boarded the submarine. They faced the darkness and the water and the demolition charges and the possibility that they would die inside an enemy vessel in the middle of the Atlantic. And they succeeded, and the war changed because of it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and sacrifice and the decisions that change history, consider subscribing to this channel for more stories like this. Leave a like if you believe the risk was worth it. And tell me in the comments, would you have made the same choice Gallery made, or would you have let U-505 sink and moved on to the next contact? History turned on that decision. What would yours have been?